Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Not Learn, something a little different today. This is my second channel where we do things that are a little bit more informal, but honestly, we cover a lot of the same subjects. So obviously today we're just going to talk a little bit more about COVID because, nobody's tired of talking about that just yet. As presumably everybody knows at this point, the big story is really the resurgence of COVID. We're relaxing all of our restrictions and kind of doing a whole lot of nothing at this point in a lot of states. And predictably, it's all kind of coming back. And the biggest offenders here are California, Texas, and Florida. They all kind of reopened. Like, for instance, California started reopening, I think, in late May. And since then, people have been crowding the beaches, no masks, no social distancing. We seem to have actually reached the point where people just don't give a fuck anymore. Which is great, because that's exactly what happened during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which we'll cover briefly in a moment. But that's just a recipe for a second wave right there, with flu season coming on. So that's about to be interesting. But it seems like a lot of these death in case rates are coming back up in a couple of states, which makes sense given a lot of the things that are happening in America these days, like, for instance, the George Floyd protests, which I'm totally behind. I'm all about the whole Black Lives Matters thing and all that stuff. Racism is a real problem in America, and we do need to take some pretty, dramatic measures for it. But as far as the George Floyd protests, I do have an issue as far as timing. I mean, now? That's really my issue, is really right now. Is this the appropriate response right now? Because more generally, I think this is the appropriate response. It's just that we had Breonna Taylor, we had Philando Castile, we had all these cases where it was like we had video. We saw it happen, and nobody gave a shit until now. I mean, I get it. What's different between now and then? There's essentially nothing different between now and the previous cases. They were all just as horrible in the past. But now everybody's unemployed and we have nothing else to friggin' do. So we all go out in the streets and protest. And frankly, I think that's reckless. I really do think that's reckless. I think that's just because it's for a good cause doesn't mean that it's not a stupid thing to do. And hear me out on that. I know that's kind of a strong thing to say, but between 2017 and 2020, 772 black people were shot and killed by the cops. Okay? And in less than a year, COVID-19 has killed over 142,000 people total. Black, white, Hispanic, etc. Now, black people, every 1 in 1,450 black people who get COVID, died. And with an age-adjusted mortality, that's like 3.8 times higher than white people. COVID-19 disproportionately affects black people. And so 142,000 deaths in just a couple of months, right? If there's a disproportionate effect on black people, there's going to be way more than 772 people who are already dead. So in the coming months, there's going to be way more than 772 black people who will die in the coming months. And that difference, there's going to be a huge difference because people went out on the street and protested, and because other people just don't give a damn. But the thing is, this is not the time. It really seems by just the numbers, we're doing more harm than good by protesting at this point. As much as I get the reason for it and the fact that it's necessary, it should have been done either before this or after this. It's not that you can't protest indefinitely. It's that there is a span of time during this active pandemic before we've reached any sort of endemic equilibrium or a vaccine solution or whatever it is, whatever endpoint this ultimately ends up coming to. Before we've reached that, I mean, going out in the streets and protesting and doing all this stuff where there's large groups of people, without masks, large groups of people that may not be particularly conscientious about how they act when they get home from their protests or whether they or not they get tested. This is all going to contribute to a lot of black people dying. And it just seems like it defeats the purpose more than anything. Going forward, we've noticed an interesting trend, at least here in Michigan, amongst the intensivists that talk to each other and kind of pool their resources. It seems that while we are getting more COVID cases, we're not seeing as much of COVID deaths. And so there is the possibility of the virus kind of changing. It could become more infectious and less contagious. It could become less infectious and more contagious, which seems to potentially be the case here. Or the 1918 flu pandemic was known to have changed in terms of its severity, the way it acted in the first, second, and third waves. It got worse for the second wave and then kind of was in the middle for the third wave. You could see varying behaviors for COVID-19 as well during this outbreak or this pandemic. However, that may or may not end up being the case going forward, just because, it seems that at this point, like right now, as this video is being filmed, we are seeing more of an uptick in deaths. So that assessment that we're not seeing the deaths anymore might be a bit premature, because those are generally going to lag behind the cases a little bit, and we may just not have seen them until, just now. One more thing that people have definitely been asking me about is organ damage and stuff in asymptomatic cases. First, you got to really define what you mean by asymptomatic. What is asymptomatic? Asymptomatic can mean mildly symptomatic to the point where I thought it was asymptomatic, or it can mean pre-symptomatic, because people can be having viral shedding and have symptoms later after they were surveyed, right? You ask them whether they are having symptoms right now or before now. That may be a no, and they get listed as asymptomatic, but they could really just be pre-symptomatic. That's another possibility. Now, the other thing about this, as I think I briefly touched on in my Learn video, is that people with COVID-19 tend to have what is called apathetic hypoxia or happy hypoxia. They have these low O2 sets and they feel fine, in which case it's easier to have somebody who is subjectively asymptomatic who may actually be having some stuff going on with their lungs. And so this is something that they've found in people who are asymptomatic, who tested positive for instance, the COVID antibody, who then had some infiltrates on chest x-ray or even not. They could have been found to have some potential scarring on their lungs afterwards. I've also heard some case reports of people with like neurological dysfunctions. Some of these are transient minor neurological dysfunctions. Some are somewhat more major. And there's been a variety of that. The significance of this is relatively unclear, but definitely something to keep an eye on, because like I touched on in the other video, there's always that we don't know the long-term consequences. Remember, with measles, there was the subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. Could we develop something like that with this? We're not going to know until years down the road. Years down the road. We have no idea. It's just the kind of thing that we can kind of look and watch and wait and see what happens. Another subject that I alluded to in the first video that I said I would talk about a little bit more in this video is that Henry Ford hydroxychloroquine study that potentially showed some mortality benefit. And in fact, it was a good bit of mortality benefit, so much so that it is kind of like weird. It's weird because there is already a body of literature regarding this. And it really seems as though everything else is saying, okay, this doesn't really work so much. And I'm not really including that retracted Lancet study. It's everything else. There have been some smaller scale randomized control trials, etc., that have looked at this, some of which are cited in my bibliography page for my Learn video. And this goes all the way against that. And it should be noted that this is one study, and there are a couple of drawbacks to it. One is that it's strictly observational. There's no prospective nature of it, really. It's not a randomized controlled trial. And that's really, it means a couple different things. It is retrospective. It looks backwards at what was done and tries to analyze what they saw. It is non-randomized, non-blinded. And it's region limited. So this is all just Henry Ford hospitals. And they emphasize in the paper itself that there's like 5 institutions or whatever. Sure, but it's all in the same kind of metropolitan area. So it's not really all that geographically varied. On top of that, that particular study, if you look at their last paragraph, they're aware of where their study stands in the literature. They say, use these results very much with caution. It's really more a matter of, if anything, it's a call for more study. If anything, it is not really a study that you would use to change actual practices. And as you've noticed, the FDA has not changed anything. They revoked hydroxychloroquine's approval for use despite not being actually indicated for COVID-19. And at this point, that has not changed. The FDA still, this is not approved for hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19. And, once again, who knows? Maybe that'll change in the future, but I really doubt it. You got to really look at the whole body of literature, as it were, to get a sense for what you need to, what's important, what's worth believing. It's the preponderance of evidence, not any single study. And really the other randomized controlled, blinded, placebo-controlled studies, on the whole, tend to say that hydroxychloroquine doesn't really do a whole lot, especially for patients that need oxygen. And really, when it comes right down to it, if you don't need oxygen, you're not going to come to the hospital. You don't really necessarily need to take hydroxychloroquine anyway. Now, in the future, this may change as now even, Henry Ford itself is going on to do some pre- and post-exposure hydroxychloroquine prophylaxis studies. So taking it before you've been exposed, after you've been exposed, that kind of thing. Which, like I said in the other video, we don't know whether that's a thing, if there's anything that can really do good for prophylaxis. So we'll see what Henry Ford has to say in the future, but then we're also going to look out for some randomized controlled trials. One more thing to mention about the Henry Ford study is just that once you go all the way to the bottom of it, you also got to take into account the financial disclosure section. One thing that you're going to definitely notice if you go down to that part is that it's funded by Bayer and Gilead, which is interesting. It doesn't invalidate the study entirely just because of that. You can be, funded by whatever and still get good results. But it's another reason to potentially take this with a grain of salt. It's funded by Bayer and Gilead. These are companies that could potentially profit off of, a drug being considered useful or not useful in the COVID pandemic. One thing that I personally found kind of enlightening is to compare COVID to other past pandemics. Like, for instance, the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Remember, HIV is the virus itself, human immunodeficiency virus. AIDS is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. When HIV kind of really overwhelms your body and your immune system, and what's called your CD4 T cells, your CD4 count, it's a special type of immune cell that HIV really does a number on. Once that goes below a certain point, you become very susceptible to having weird infections that normally can't do anything to you. But if your immune system sucks, then they can do a lot of stuff to you. So 1.2 million people have been diagnosed with AIDS since the start of the AIDS pandemic. And we're still getting something like 30,000 new cases per year. And worldwide, that's something like 25 million total dead. So the body count for HIV and AIDS is really high. It's really high, but it's decades long, too. It's been around for quite some time. We are nowhere near close to overtaking HIV at this point for deaths. But we are past Ebola. So Ebola was first recognized in 1976. It's one of those things that's very infectious. It kills the shit out of you. But it's not very contagious. You need kind of direct contact to spread it. And there really wasn't any asymptomatic transmission. Once you got it, you typically showed symptoms if you actually got it. And really, that's kind of the kiss of death. If you don't have like a period where you can just kind of fly under the radar and not do a whole lot, or have a proportion of the population that just goes around spreading, you're not going to get too far as a virus. So Ebola really only killed 11,000 deaths since 1976, which is not very much. So we've passed Ebola. What we haven't even come close to is the Black Death, right? The Black Death is one of these things that's mythical almost. If you look at its death count, you get numbers from, 200 million to 600 million, a third of Europe to 2/3 of Europe. That's a big spread. So ultimately, we don't have exact numbers for kind of that kind of thing. Obviously, it was back in, the Dark Ages. But what we do know is no matter which numbers you choose, it is the worst pandemic in human history. And the Black Death is, if you're going to look at that by organism, it's Yersinia pestis. And really, there's multiple plagues throughout history, like the Justinian plague, that really were just Yersinia pestis, but a different epidemic that didn't quite break out into Black Death territory. But it was all kind of the same organism. So yeah, COVID-19 is nowhere near the Black Death and will likely never even approach it. And then there's smallpox. 500 million people killed in the last 100 years, and now mostly eradicated because of vaccines. We're nowhere near that, but frankly, yeah, no, I don't think it will ever even come close to smallpox. Yeah, we're not going to approach smallpox with COVID-19. We're not quite there, and I don't think we ever will be. Outside of all the medical stuff, once you get rid of all that, medical stuff is what we're dealing with right now. But I think what we're going to be dealing with going forward, that's really important to think about, is the economic impact of not only COVID-19 and the healthcare related costs associated with it, but the cost of not doing things for COVID-19. Right? There's the whole debate of lockdown versus no lockdown. Explicitly try and save the economy for right now versus, try and save the economy or try and save, I guess, lives. That's kind of the debate there. Do we want to do everything we can and lock things down to save lives, or do we just want to open things up because the threat to the economy in the short term is too great? I don't know that that's the clearest cut argument, because ultimately, if you were to open things up and the curve unflattens and now the healthcare system is really not dealing with things very well, there's going to be a lot of death. There's going to be a lot of excess mortality that didn't need to happen. And there's going to be decrease in overall productivity, right? Because people will be dead. Dead people don't produce anything. That is going to be a real hit to the economy, because sure, a lot of the ones that will die will be elderly and immunocompromised. Maybe they're not working so much anymore anyway. But there's lots of parts of the economy that are tied to these people. Even if they themselves aren't being productive, they need people to be productive on their behalf, like for them. If you're old and not working, you may need a caretaker, etc. Those are jobs, right? That all factors into the economy more broadly. And if there's large numbers of people that die, you're going to see a huge effect from that. And we've already seen an effect because of just consumer confidence, in the stock market at least, right? Because in the middle of the pandemic, if you remember, there was, what everybody knows is that the stock market took a huge hit. Everybody knows that part. But what's somewhat less known is what the Federal Reserve did to try and halt that, terrifying fall. And basically, at first, they did a lot of different measures of what they call quantitative easing, which is how they typically will try and respond to something that is like this, like a liquidity crisis. So they dropped their interest rates to near zero, like right away, which is kind of crazy, right? Because they never do that. Even when during the Great Recession, the Great Financial Crisis of 2008, they didn't go all the way to zero. That's just not a thing. You go down slowly, and then as the situation evolves, you keep going down. Zero and near zero are the big guns that you save for later. The Fed just went straight to, nope, this is serious. We're going straight down. And the crazy shit is that it didn't do anything. Like immediately after, there was like a little blip, like the stock market, like kind of stopped for a second, it acknowledged that, and then kept free falling. It was nuts. And then the Federal Reserve, having seen that, got real nervous, and they come out and say, okay, look, guys, we're the Federal Reserve. We have unlimited money. They literally came out and said, look, we have unlimited money. We'll give you unlimited money. Don't be scared. That is the craziest shit I've ever heard. And even that still didn't work, right? The market kept free falling after they pledged unlimited money. Now, then they gave the checks. They gave a bunch of people a bunch of money. They injected liquidity directly in the market by literally giving everybody $1,200. That was an interesting program. One of the immediate effects of that people might imagine is inflation, which hasn't quite yet happened to the degree that you might expect it to, given how much money has been injected into the economy lately. Part of that is because people are not actually necessarily going out and spending a whole lot of that. They're still cooped up at home. This may change in the next couple of months as things start to unlock down and people start going out and spending their money. We're not going to be able to see the effects of long-term inflation on this until the economy starts to get into a more dynamic normal equilibrium that we've come to expect. Will there be another dip? That's the other big question. Will there be another dip? I think probably. I don't know. I'm not exactly a financial expert, but I think probably, especially because now that we're relocking things down, those initial stock market free falls were really directed at, what consumers or what investors thought was going to happen in the future. And the reason they freaked out so much is because of these prolonged lockdowns. And part of, I don't think anybody knows, but I think part of why the stock market kept going up recently is just because people think it's going to be okay now. They've assuaged a lot of investor fears. But then also the Fed's promises are starting to kind of kick in. People are starting to think, okay, so they're going to give us unlimited money. These companies are potentially going to just be okay. They're just going to get unlimited money, right? But then there's the concern that if you just print unlimited money, the money is going to become worthless. And that is definitely a long-term concern, because ultimately what's happening short-term right now is a liquidity crisis. It's a lack of money circulating in the system, right? The system is not liquid enough. You kind of solve liquidity crisis by injecting liquidity into the system. And that's what the Fed is kind of trying to do right now. So it not only gave people money, but it also bought certain types of financial products that allow it to inject money into the system. Because the Fed isn't allowed to invest in things directly, but it created another entity that it uses to inject money into the... It's complicated. We'll talk about it more in another video. But basically, after you've printed all this extra money, after you've handed all of that out, where did you get that money? Right? Where did that money come from? That's all just extra money. That's all debt. That's the real thing that's going on there. That is all debt. We've taken on trillions of dollars of debt since the start of this crisis. And we started off with trillions of dollars of debt at the start of this crisis. What you got to realize is that according to the Institute of International Finance, global debt is something like $253 trillion as of 2019, which puts it as a global debt to GDP ratio of 322%, which is ridiculous. Put it in for perspective. Once you get to something like 70% for a national debt to GDP, once you get to something like 70% debt to GDP ratio, you start to see noticeable economic slowdowns. On a global level, we are at 322%. The entire global financial system has way more debt than actual GDP. It's not producing nearly as much as it owes. And that rate of what it owes is going up way faster than what we're producing. We are addicted to leverage globally. And this is not just a national screwing up the budget kind of problem. This is on the level of corporate debt. This is on the level of individual debt. And it's on the level of national debt. All of this together, we are not keeping pace with our debt. And ultimately, we're also seeing a bunch of deaths and a bunch of stuff from COVID, which will decrease our overall productivity, which is going to cause a massive shrink in overall GDP. Especially, we already know the United States' GDP is going to go down. It's going to go down. It's going to contract dramatically. It depends on how you define dramatic, but it's going to be a good bit. Our overall economy is going to go down, despite what the stock market says. Remember, the stock market is not the economy. You got to keep that in mind. The stock market is not the economy. It's just the stock market. It's one potential indicator. GDP going down, unemployment going up, these are better indicators of how the actual overall economy is going, but the stock market is really not.